I didn't know her name yet the night I walked out into the parking lot with a key in my hand and no idea whether I was about to ruin everything. It was 11:40 at night. The neon sign above my diner buzzed the way it always did, that low electric hum that had become the soundtrack of my life. The lot was empty except for one car, a gray sedan with a cracked back window and a bumper held on by two zip ties, parked in the far corner under the busted light where nobody would look twice. And inside that car, curled up in the driver's seat with her coat pulled up to her chin, was the woman who had been sitting in my diner every single night for 11 days, ordering the cheapest coffee on the menu and making it last 3 hours. Her name was Nora. I would learn that later. Right then, all I knew was that she had been sleeping in that car, and I had known it for at least a week, and I had done nothing about it because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. I stood there in the cold with my breath fogging in front of me and the key to the apartment above my diner in my fist. And I told myself if I put this under her windshield wiper, I could never take it back. But let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what kind of man I was before she walked through my door. My name is Owen Bright. I'm 33 years old and I own a diner off Route 9 outside Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It's called Bright's, which was my father's joke, because he thought it was funny that our last name made the place sound cheerful when the coffee was mediocre and the booths were held together with duct tape. He died 4 years ago. Cancer, the slow kind. The kind that gives you time to say everything and then makes you regret every word you didn't say. My mother had passed 6 years before that. So the diner came to me and I kept it, not because I loved it, but because letting it go felt like burying him twice. I lived in the apartment above it. 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a leaky faucet I never fixed, and a window that looked out over the parking lot and the highway and the dark line of pines beyond it. I opened at 6 every morning. I closed at midnight. I did the books on Sunday. That was my life. There was a woman once a long time ago. Her name was Claire, and she left me a note on the kitchen counter that said she couldn't spend her whole life waiting for me to come upstairs. She was right. I never blamed her for it. I just never got around to changing. So when I say I was afraid of what would happen if I helped this woman, I want you to understand what I was really afraid of. It wasn't her. It was the version of me that would exist after. The first night she came in was a Tuesday in late October. Rain was coming down hard enough to make the parking lot look like a black lake, and I was wiping down the counter at 9:30 thinking about closing early. The bell over the door rang. She came in soaked through, hair plastered to her forehead, holding a canvas bag against her chest like it held something that would break if she set it down. She was maybe 30. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, a face that would have been striking if it hadn't been so tired. She looked around the diner the way people look around a room they're not sure they're allowed to be in. Then she walked to the booth in the far corner, the one by the window where the heater doesn't quite reach, and she sat down without taking off her coat. I brought her a menu. She didn't open it. "Just coffee," she said. "The regular kind." Her voice was low and careful, like she was rationing it. "Anything to eat?" She looked at the menu on the table without touching it. "No, thank you." That was it. That was the whole conversation. I brought her the coffee. $1.75 refills free. She wrapped both hands around the mug like it was the only warm thing in the world, and she sat there and looked out the window at the rain, and she didn't move for 3 hours. At 12:15, I told her we were closing. She apologized. That was the part I remember most clearly. She apologized to me. She said she was sorry for staying so long, and she opened her wallet, and I watched her count out exact change with the kind of concentration that told me she had counted that money more than once that day. She left $2, 25 cents tip. She looked embarrassed about it, and I wanted to tell her not to be, and I didn't, because I didn't know how. Then she walked out into the rain, and I locked the door behind her, and that would have been the end of it. A woman came in, drank coffee, left. That happens 20 times a day. Except that when I went upstairs and turned off the lights and stood at my window looking out over the lot, her car was still there. It didn't leave. I watched for 20 minutes. It just sat there in the corner under the broken light with the windows fogging up from the inside. And eventually I made myself go to bed, and I told myself she was probably on the phone, or waiting for someone, or resting her eyes before a long drive. I told myself a lot of things that night. The next morning, the car was gone. And the next night at 9:30, the bell over the door rang again. She sat in the same booth. She ordered the same coffee. She said thank you the same careful way. And this time when she left, I didn't go upstairs. I stood in the dark kitchen with the lights off, and I watched through the window as she got into her car, and she didn't start the engine. She reached into the back seat and pulled out a blanket. And she leaned the driver's seat back as far as it would go. That was the moment I knew. And here's what I did about it. Nothing. Not that night, and not the next one, and not the one after that. I want to be honest about that, because I've replayed it enough times to know exactly what it says about me. I stood at that window every night for over a week, and I watched a woman sleep in a car in a New Hampshire October. And I didn't knock on the glass, and I didn't offer her anything, because some part of me had convinced itself that saying something would be worse than saying nothing, that it would humiliate her, that it would cross a line she had drawn very carefully around herself. That's what I told myself. The truth is closer to this. If I said something, then it became my problem, and I had spent 4 years making very sure that nothing was my problem. So instead, I did what cowards do. I got clever. I started giving her the coffee for free and telling her the pot was going to get dumped anyway. She looked at me the first time like she was trying to decide whether to be insulted. Then she said thank you and looked back out the window. I started leaving the heat on longer in her corner. I moved the pie case so it blocked the draft from the door. Small things. Invisible things. Things that let me feel like I was doing something without ever having to actually say the sentence out loud. On the 7th night, I made a mistake. I brought her a plate of eggs and toast that she hadn't ordered and set it down in front of her and said the cook made an extra order. It was almost 11 o'clock. There was no cook. I was the cook. She looked at the plate. Then she looked at me. And she didn't say anything for a long moment, and I felt my face get hot, and I understood that she knew exactly what I was doing and exactly what it meant that I was doing it. Owen, she said. It was the first time she'd used my name. It's on the sign. It's on my shirt. But hearing her say it out loud in that empty diner did something to my chest I wasn't prepared for. Yeah, I'm not a stray. I stood there with my hands empty and no idea what to say. I didn't mean, I know what you meant? She pushed the plate an inch away from herself. Not far, just an inch. But if you start feeling sorry for me, then I have to start being someone you feel sorry for. And I can't afford that right now. Do you understand? I did. God help me, I understood exactly. Because that was the same reason I hadn't fixed the faucet or sold the diner or called Claire back all those years ago. If you admit that something is wrong, then you have to be a person who has something wrong with them. It's easier to just keep pouring coffee. I'm not feeling sorry for you, I said. She raised an eyebrow. Then what? And I don't know why I told her the truth. Maybe because it was late and the diner was empty and the rain had started again. Maybe because she was the first person in 4 years who had looked at me long enough to make me want to be seen. I lost my father 4 years ago, I said. He was sick for 8 months. Every night that year, I made him dinner and brought it up to his room, and I sat with him while he pretended to eat it. And when he died, the worst part wasn't the funeral. The worst part was that I still made 2 plates for about a month afterward. I'd just make them without thinking, and then I'd stand there in the kitchen looking at the extra one. I nodded at the eggs. So no, I don't feel sorry for you. I just haven't had anybody to cook for in a long time, and it's a hard habit to lose. She didn't answer. She looked at the plate for maybe 10 seconds. Then she picked up the fork, and she ate every bite of it. And she didn't look at me while she did. And when she was done, she pushed the empty plate to the edge of the table and said, very quietly, "Thank you." And then she said, "My name is Nora." That was the 8th night, which brings me back to the parking lot. The 11th night, 11:40, cold enough that my hands ached, standing there with a key. I hadn't decided to do it. I'd gone up to my apartment after close, and I'd stood at that window like always, and I'd watched the light go out inside her car. And I'd thought about the fact that the temperature was supposed to drop to 26 degrees before morning. 26. That's not a bad night in a car. That's a dangerous one. And I stood there for a long time, arguing with myself, and then I turned around and I opened the drawer where I keep the spare keys, and I took out the one for the storage apartment. Because here's what I hadn't told her. The diner has 2 apartments above it. Mine and the one my father kept for the night manager back when the place was busy enough to need one. It's been empty for 6 years. It's small. One room, a bathroom, a hot plate, a radiator that clanks like someone hitting a pipe with a wrench. But it has a lock on the door and a window and 4 walls and heat. And it was sitting there, empty, 20 feet above a woman sleeping in a car in 26-degree weather. I wrote the note on a receipt slip. 4 sentences. I rewrote it 6 times before I got it right, because I knew that if I got one word wrong, she would never come back to my diner again, and I would have taken the only warm room she had. In the end, it said this: Nora, there's an empty apartment above the diner. It's been empty for 6 years, and it will keep being empty whether you use it or not. This is not charity. It is an unused room, and I am tired of paying to heat it for nobody. If you want it, the door is the one on the left at the top of the outside stairs. If you don't, throw this away and I'll never mention it again, and your coffee is still free. I read it 4 times. Then I walked out into the lot in my shirt sleeves because I was too much of a coward to spend the time it would take to put on a coat. And I slid the note and the key under the driver's side windshield wiper of a gray sedan with a cracked back window, and I walked away without looking back. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed and listened for the sound of an engine starting because I was sure that was what would happen. She would wake up, find the key, understand that I'd known this whole time, and drive away, and I would never see her again. And I would spend the rest of my life knowing that I'd finally worked up the courage to do one decent thing and I'd done it wrong. At 4 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the outside stairs. Slow ones, they stopped at the top. They stayed there for what felt like a full minute. And then I heard the door on the left open and close and lock. And then I heard the radiator start to clank. I have never in my life been so glad to hear a broken pipe. She didn't come down the next morning. Or the one after. I opened at 6 like always, and I made coffee and flipped eggs for the truckers and the road crew and the retired guys who came in at 7 to argue about the Red Sox. And the whole time I kept looking at the ceiling like an idiot. On the 3rd morning, I heard her on the stairs at 6:30. She came in through the front door, not the back, which I understood immediately was deliberate. She was wearing a clean shirt and her hair was pulled back and she looked like she'd actually slept, for the first time in a long time. She walked straight up to the counter and she put a folded $20 bill on it. "Rent," she said. "It's not enough." "I know it's not enough. I'll bring more Friday." I looked at the 20, and I want to tell you I said something wise. I want to tell you I pushed it back and made some noble speech about how she didn't owe me anything. But I looked at her face, and I saw that this $20 was the thing standing between her and drowning, and that if I took it away from her, she would drown politely and quietly, and I would never even know. So I picked it up and I put it in the register and I said, "Then that's rent." And something in her shoulders came down about an inch. "Do you need help?" she asked. "In here." "I'm not sitting up there doing nothing. I can't afford another—" I didn't say pay me. Her chin came up. I said I'm not sitting up there doing nothing. So that's how Nora Vance started working at Bright's Diner. I put her on days first, which was a mistake because she was terrible at it. Not the work. She was good at the work. She was fast and she was clean and she never dropped anything. She was terrible at the people. When Marge Halloran asked her where she was from, she said around and walked away. When one of the road crew guys tried to flirt with her, she gave him a look that made him apologize to his own coffee. She had a wall around her that you could feel from the other side of the room, and everybody could feel it, and everybody left her alone. Everybody except my regulars, who are the nosiest human beings in the state of New Hampshire. Where'd you find her? That was Wendell Fisk, 78 years old, been eating breakfast at that same stool since my father ran the place. She came in the door, Wendell. That's not what I asked, and you know it. Drink your coffee. He drank his coffee. Then he said, without looking at me, "Boy, you've been alone in this building for 4 years, and I've watched you get quieter every one of them. Whatever she is, don't screw it up." I didn't answer him, but I thought about it all day. It took 2 weeks before she told me anything real. It was a Sunday night after close, and I was doing the books at the counter, and she was mopping. And she stopped mopping and stood there with both hands on the handle and said, "You've never asked me." I looked up. "Asked you what?" "Why I was in the car." I set down my pen. "Figured you'd tell me when you wanted to. Most people would have asked. I'm not most people. I'm somebody who spent 4 years hoping nobody would ask him anything. That got the smallest possible smile out of her. Then it went away. She leaned the mop against the booth and sat down across from me at the counter, and she looked at her hands for a while before she started. She'd been married 6 years. His name was Grant Delaney, and he was a commercial real estate guy in Boston, the kind who wore good shoes and remembered everybody's name and made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. Everyone loved Grant. That was the first thing she said about him. Everyone loved him. He never hit her. She said that too, and she said it in a strange, flat way that told me she'd had to explain this before to people who didn't understand. He never hit her. He just spent 6 years making her smaller. He told her friends were bad for her, and then one day she noticed she didn't have any. He told her she didn't need to work, and then he controlled the money. He told her she was too sensitive when she cried, and too cold when she didn't. He told her that nobody else would put up with her. And she said the worst part, the part she still couldn't forgive herself for, was that she started to agree with him. And then 8 months ago, she found out he'd been having an affair with a woman at his office for 3 years. And when she confronted him, he laughed at her. Not angry. He laughed. And he said, "Where are you going to go, Nora?" And that was the sentence that finally did it. Because he was right. She had no money, no job, no family left. Her mother had died when she was 19, and her father hadn't been in the picture since she was a kid. She had nothing but the car, which was in her name because he'd thought it was too old and ugly to bother with. So she took the car. She took a canvas bag with 3 shirts and her mother's watch and a photograph. And she drove north until the city stopped. And she'd been moving between towns for 8 months, working cash jobs when she could get them, sleeping in the car when she couldn't afford anything else, because she was terrified that if she stayed anywhere long enough to be found, he would find her, not because he wanted her back, because he couldn't stand to lose. "So that's it," she said. "That's the whole thing." She was staring at a spot on the counter. Her hands were flat on the table and they were completely still, which is somehow worse than shaking. "He was right about one thing," she said. "I didn't have anywhere to go." I sat there and I didn't say anything for a long moment, because there were 10 things I wanted to say and 9 of them were wrong. What I finally said was this. "Nora," she looked up, "you've had somewhere to go for 3 weeks now. It's upstairs." She didn't cry. I want you to understand that about her. She never once cried in front of me during that whole first winter. But her eyes went bright, and she looked away fast, out the black window at the empty lot, and she said very quietly, "Don't be kind to me right now. I'm not ready for it." "Okay," I said, and I picked up my pen and went back to the books, and she picked up the mop, and we didn't say another word for the rest of the night. That was the moment I fell in love with her. Not the moment I knew it. That took a lot longer. But that was the moment, right there in an empty diner at 1 in the morning with the smell of bleach and a woman who wouldn't cry. Winter came in hard that year. The kind of winter where the parking lot is a sheet of ice by 6 in the morning, and the pines go so heavy with snow that they bend over the road like they're listening for something. And somewhere in the middle of it, without either of us saying anything about it, Bright's Diner stopped being a place where I lived alone. She learned the regulars. That was the first thing. She learned that Wendell takes his eggs so overcooked they squeak and gets offended if you make them right. She learned that the road crew comes in at 5:40 and needs to be out by 6:10, and she started having their coffee poured before they were through the door. She learned that Marge Halloran talks so much because she goes home to an empty house, and she started sitting down across from her for 2 minutes every morning, which is a thing I had never once thought to do in 4 years of serving that woman breakfast. The wall was still there, but it had a door in it now, and she'd started opening it for people. In January, the fryer died on a Saturday morning with a full house, and I was on my back under it with a wrench in the dark and grease dripping on my face, and I said something my father would have hit me for, and I heard her laugh. Out loud. It stopped me cold. I lay there under that fryer in the dark, and I listened to a sound I had never heard before, and I stared up at a rusted metal pan, and I thought, oh no. That's what I thought. Not something beautiful, just oh no. In February, she started fixing things. It began with the faucet upstairs in my apartment, which she noticed had been dripping the entire time she'd known me. and which she fixed one afternoon with a washer she bought for 40 cents and a wrench she borrowed without asking. I came upstairs and the kitchen was silent for the first time in 6 years, and I stood there in the doorway, and I didn't understand what was wrong until I realized what was missing. Then she started on the diner. The booth with the wobble, the screen door that didn't latch, the neon sign that had been buzzing since I was a teenager. She'd find the problem, and then she'd fix it, and then she'd never mention it again. And I started to understand what she was doing. She was building a place where she could stand still. 8 months of moving, of never unpacking, of leaving before anybody could learn her name. And now every screw she tightened was a small, stubborn argument with the part of her that still had one foot in that car. In March, I found her sitting on the outside stairs at 2 in the morning with her coat on over her pajamas, and she was just looking at the parking lot. I sat down next to her. It was cold enough to see our breath. She said, "I keep waking up and not knowing where I am." "That's normal." "No, it isn't." She wrapped her arms around her knees. "I wake up and for about 4 seconds I don't know where I am, and I think I have to get up and move the car before someone knocks on the window. And then I remember, and then I lie there feeling stupid." She was quiet a second. "How long does that last?" "I don't know," I said. "I still make 2 plates sometimes." She turned her head and looked at me. And I looked back. And neither of us said anything. And neither of us moved. And the cold came up through the concrete steps, and the neon sign hummed above us, and the whole world was about 6 inches wide. She stood up first. "Good night, Owen. Good night, Nora. That's all." That's what happened. And I sat on those stairs for another 20 minutes after she went inside in the cold, feeling like a man who had just missed a train and couldn't decide whether he was relieved. He came in on a Thursday in April at 2:10 in the afternoon, and I knew who he was before he said a word. Because Nora dropped a plate. She had never dropped anything in 5 months. It hit the tile and went off like a gunshot, and the whole diner turned. And she was standing there in the middle of the floor with her hands still shaped around a plate that wasn't there anymore, staring at the door. Grant Delaney was maybe 40. Good coat, good haircut. The kind of face that looks friendly right up until you spend 6 years with it. He looked around my diner the way you'd look at a photograph of somewhere you'd never bother going. And then he smiled at her, warm as anything, and he said, "There you are." I came out from behind the counter. He didn't even look at me. He walked toward her, unhurried, hands in his pockets, and he said, "Nora, honey, do you have any idea what you've put me through?" And I watched something happen to her that I will not forget as long as I live. She got smaller, not physically, but her shoulders came in and her chin went down, and her eyes went to the floor, and in the space of about 2 seconds, every single thing she had rebuilt over 5 months just folded up and disappeared. And she was somebody's property again. "Grant," she said. Her voice had gone thin. "How did you—" "Your car's registered, sweetheart." "It's not complicated." He said it gently. That was the thing. He said everything gently. "Come on, get your things. We're not doing this here." And she took a step toward him. "I want you to understand that." She took a step. That's what 6 years does. And that's when I put myself between them. I'm not a fighter. I've never hit anybody in my life. I'm a guy who makes eggs. But I stepped in front of her and I said, "She's working." He looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time, and he took in the apron and the flower on my sleeve and the 10-year-old shoes, and I watched him decide exactly how much I was worth. "I'm sorry," he said pleasantly.
"Who are you?"
"Owen Bright. It's my diner." "Great," he smiled. "Owen, this is between me and my wife." "Then she can tell me that." And I turned around. I turned my back on him, which was probably stupid, and I looked at Nora, and her face was white, and her hands were shaking, and she was looking at the floor. And I said, "Nora." She didn't look up. "Nora." Nothing. So I said the only thing I could think of. "Do you want a cup of coffee?" She raised her head, and she stared at me like I had lost my mind. And I stood there in front of a man who had spent 6 years teaching her that she was nothing, and I said it again. "It's 11:40. You always come in at 9:30, and you always order coffee, and you always sit in that booth by the window. So, do you want a cup of coffee?" It was 2 in the afternoon. It was the wrong time and the wrong words, and it made no sense at all. But she understood. I watched her understand. Because what I was actually asking her was, do you remember who you were before he walked through that door? And do you want to be her again? And are you going to let me stand here while you decide? And Nora Vance took a breath. And she straightened up. And she said, yes, thank you. And she walked past both of us, and she sat down in the booth by the window. The whole diner was silent. Wendell Fisk was on his stool with his fork halfway to his mouth. Marge had turned all the way around. The road crew guys had put down their phones. Grant's face did something ugly for about half a second, and then it smoothed back over, and he laughed. He laughed, and he shook his head, and he said, Nora, really? This? He gestured at the diner, at the cracked booths and the taped-up seats and the pie case. This is what you left me for? A gas station with a griddle? And that was his mistake, because Marge Halloran stood up. Marge Halloran, who is 5'1" and 81 years old and has been coming to this diner since before I was born. And she said, Sir, I'd like you to leave. Then Wendell got up. Then the road crew, all 4 of them in their orange vests, and one of them was 6'5" and had never spoken more than 9 words to me in his life. Nobody touched him. Nobody threatened him. They just stood up. And Grant Delaney looked around a room full of people who had eaten breakfast beside a woman for 5 months. And he understood, finally, that he'd walked into somewhere he did not own. He turned back to her, and he lowered his voice, and he said the last thing he'd ever say to her. You'll come back. You've got nowhere else to go. And Nora, sitting in her booth with her hands around a coffee cup that I had put there without either of us noticing, looked up at him and said very calmly, Grant, I'm home. He left. The bell over the door rang behind him, and nobody said anything, and then the 6'5" guy sat back down and picked up his fork and said, This omelet's cold, Owen. And the whole place broke. She didn't cry that day either. She worked her shift. She wiped down the counter. She said goodnight to Marge, and at 11 o'clock, when I was locking the front door, she was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and she said, Owen. I turned around, and she was crying. Finally, after 5 months, standing in an empty diner in a dirty apron, absolutely falling apart, and she put her hand over her mouth and said, I almost went with him. I took a step. I know. I hate that I took a step. Nora. I crossed the floor. You took 1 step toward him. And then you sat down in that booth, which is 1 more step than you took in 6 years. She shook her head, and she was crying too hard to talk, and I did the only thing I had left. I opened my arms, and I waited, because that was the whole thing, wasn't it? That was the whole point. I wasn't going to reach for her. She had spent 6 years being reached for and grabbed and moved around like furniture. So I stood there in the middle of my father's diner with my arms open, and I let her decide. And she came. She put her face in my shoulder, and she cried like she'd been saving it up for 8 months, which she had, and I stood there and held on and didn't say anything at all. And after a long time, she said, into my shirt, so quietly I almost missed it. You left a key under my wiper. I did. You could have knocked on the window. I know. Why didn't you? And I said, because you'd have had to say yes to my face, and I didn't want to make you say it out loud to a stranger. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, you weren't a stranger. You'd been leaving the heat on in that corner for 11 days. And she looked up at me, and I finally understood that she had known the whole time, every single night, that a man upstairs was standing at a window watching her car and trying to work up the nerve. And she'd let him. She'd kept coming back. I kissed her at the bottom of the stairs of a diner that smelled like fryer grease and bleach, with the neon buzzing outside and April rain starting up against the windows. It was not a good kiss. Our noses got in the way, and she laughed into my mouth, and I said something extremely stupid. It was the best thing that has ever happened to me. We got married the next spring, in the parking lot, which sounds like a joke and wasn't. Wendell walked her down between the parked cars. Marge made the cake. The 6'5" road crew guy, whose name it turns out is Danny, cried harder than anybody there. We didn't have 100 guests. We had about 30, and every single one of them was someone who had eaten breakfast at that counter, and I think that's the only kind of guest list that means anything. She fixed the neon sign that summer. It took her a week and a soldering iron and a lot of swearing. It says Brights, and it doesn't buzz anymore, and every night at closing when I flip the switch, it goes out clean. We still open at 6. I still make the eggs. She runs the front, and she knows every name in the county now, and the wall she used to have is gone so completely that new customers can't believe she was ever anything but this. The apartment on the left at the top of the outside stairs is a storeroom again. Nobody sleeps there. And on cold nights, when the temperature drops and I turn off the lights and stand at the window out of old habit, I look down at that far corner of the lot, under the light that I fixed the same week she fixed the sign, and it's always empty. But I keep a spare key in the drawer by the register. I've never had to use it again. Nora asked me once why I don't just get rid of it, and I told her the truth, which is that I'm not keeping it for anybody in particular. I'm keeping it because there's a woman out there tonight in a car in a parking lot somewhere, and she's got her coat pulled up to her chin and she's telling herself she's fine. And if she ever pulls into my lot, I want to already have the key in my hand. Because here's what nobody tells you. Sometimes you're not waiting to be rescued. Sometimes you're just waiting for one person to notice you're there, and to have the decency to leave the door unlocked, and then to walk away and let you choose. She walked up those stairs herself. I never once carried her. That's the only reason she stayed.